How's it going, everyone? Schaefer here, and welcome to my 60-hour plus review of Avowed. So when Avowed came out, it came under a lot of fire when it released, and to be honest with you, I can understand why. But honestly, I enjoyed my time with it. Sure, it had some bad points, but it also had far more good, in my opinion, than it did have bad. And yeah, I generally had a good time with it. And so, let's get into it. Let's talk about it. So kicking things off here with the story. To give you a quick, rough idea here, the story is based around you being what's called a godlike, someone who has been given certain traits from a god. In Avowed, we end up with basically branches in our head. That's the trait that our god gave us, because they're like, the game is based in the living lands, and so the god is based around the living lands. They're kind of part of it, and to not say too much more, they are, nature in a way, and so that's why we have kind of these trees in our head or branches in our heads. And honestly, I think the story for me was probably one of the best parts of the game. That thing kept me going because it was asking enough questions to keep me interested. I constantly wanted to find out where my decisions were going. I wanted to find out where the game was going. And what I did like as well was that my decisions seemed to have an impact on the ending. As I went through, I made a bunch of choices. I said certain things in a certain way. We reacted in a certain way. And honestly, I was hoping all the way through that these would have an end result. They would, cultivate into something, and it would make a difference at the end of the game. And I was pleasantly surprised to find out that that is the case. It did actually make a difference. At least it felt like it made a difference. And it gave me a very satisfying ending. I thought I was actually on the bad ending, or at least I thought I was on my way to the bad ending. But I wasn't. In fact, it was quite a good ending, and I liked it. And honestly, it leaves a huge bunch of questions as to what happens if I did it a different way. What happens if I'd responded or acted in a different way? How would the game look? How would the ending look? And I think that you could have multiple endings, certainly, and they would be very different from the one that I got. But overall, I really enjoyed the story. I did think it was one of its highlights of the game. And even if you'd play it just for that, I would recommend it just through that. Moving on to the gameplay. The gameplay was probably my second favorite, maybe tied for first favorite part of the game. It was a fun, action-packed, it's a fun action RPG. That's all there is to say. It's a fun action RPG, and there's nothing wrong with that. It was a little bit on the simplified side, so there was sometimes when I wanted to customize a bit more than it would let me. And so, honestly, some of it felt really bland. And normally when I'd play these kind of games, especially RPGs, I try to make a very custom build, very unique build, or a very themed build around my character and the spells and abilities that you get. And I didn't feel like I could do that here. It just felt like there was a lot of limitations to it. And so, yeah, I would have liked a bit more customization there, but overall, it was fine, and it worked, and it was fun. It was fun to interact with. Again, along with the story, it was probably my sort of favorite part of the game. One thing I didn't like about it, though, was the game has this, weird tier-based system. And what I mean by that is that every piece of gear and every enemy has a tier from 1 to 5. And it doesn't matter how high a level you are or how low level you are. If you have the right tier of armor and weapons, then you can fight or you can't fight, or you're more efficient at fighting and less efficient at fighting. So, for example, if you have tier 1 armor and you're fighting a tier 3, you're gonna have a bad time. That's just it. You're just gonna have a bad time. They're gonna be taking a lot less damage from you, and they're gonna be dealing a lot more damage to you. Even if you were max level, it wouldn't matter, because your tier level of armor is too low. And so it has this weird limitation. What I found frustrating about this was that each zone kind of had its own sort of tiers. So let's say from zone 1 was tier 1 to tier 3, or tier 2, let's say. And you would gear up as you went across, and you got your gears level 2, so you could start fighting the enemies as you kind of finished that zone. But then as soon as you moved to the next zone, everything would change, because it would be all the next tier would be in the next zone. So you would immediately go to the next zone, everything would be a tier 3 and tier 4. And you'd just be kind of left in the lurch thinking, hang on a minute, I can't fight anymore. So you sort of build yourself up, and instead of feeling like you're constantly getting stronger as you go through the game, it feels like it resets your strength every time you go to a different zone, because every time you go, you're back at the bottom of the food chain again. You have to work your way back up through the gear. And that brought me onto another problem I had, which was that the gear that they offered you was often very limited, and I would have liked a lot more variety in gear. But what the bigger problem is, for me anyway, was that resources to upgrade that gear. So the resource to upgrade the gear to different tiers was very expensive and in very short supply, and it was very difficult to get hold of. And I found a lot of the time through my playthroughs I had to just like focus on one piece of armor or one weapon for a prolonged period of time, because I just didn't have the resources to go back and check the new armor and try different options. So that I didn't like. I would like to have a lot more option in terms of variety of gear. And honestly, I didn't like the tier system. The tier system for me could have been removed, and I would have just preferred it to be like a level-based system. But that then also adds to the next piece of issue I had with the gameplay, was that the game has limited quests and limited enemies. And what I mean is that each zone doesn't have, like, there are no repeatable quests, there are no redos that once you've done a quest, it's over with. Every quest is a one-time thing and it's over. And that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but also the enemies are as well. So if you go through a zone and get rid of a bunch of enemies in that zone, those enemies will never respawn. They're gone forever. So you can't like grind, you can't level up, or you can't, you know, if you're struggling in the next zone, you can't go back to the first zone and do some leveling up. Maybe, you know, do some easier quests or do some repeatables. It doesn't let you, you know? So you do all the quests in a zone, you move to the next zone, you just have to... I found myself struggling through a lot of the content just to get the right gear, just so that my tier level was the correct, so I could actually start fighting enemies. And sometimes that made for extremely frustrating and extremely difficult fights that took way too long to get through. And this was the theme that went throughout the entire game, and honestly something I just didn't really care much for. Because other than that, the combat itself was a lot of fun. You know, the actual act of fighting was a lot of fun. It just felt very frustrating when you went up into a new zone and you hit a tier that was too higher than you, and all of a sudden your spells did like a fraction of what they would have done previously, or your abilities did a fraction of what they did previously. Something I was just not super keen on. Moving on to the sounds and the visuals. Now, I will have to say that one of the highlights of Avowed is the visuals, the landscapes, the vistas, the views. All of the zones just looked amazing, and there were numerous times when I just had to sit there and look at them. I made tons of comments during my playthrough about them. You know, if I was to say it like this, there's some great set designs. Like, you're looking at the areas, they just look fantastic, and they all look so different from each other. They all have this really cool vibe. And during the nights, when it got dark, it was also really great as well, because a lot of the plants and a lot of the plants basically just glowed in the dark, which was a nice little touch. I thought it was quite cool to look at. And there's not really much more to say than that. Huge ton of variety, just looked great. Yeah, I mean, to look at, it was fantastic. If nothing else, if you base it on nothing else, the visuals of the landscapes and the areas I just thought were great. They all looked really cool. The sounds, I mean, they were fine. They were fine. But that's all I really have to say about the sounds. Nothing really amazing, nothing stood out. It wasn't bad, it was just fine. It just kind of worked. And now I wanted to talk about the companions of Avowed, because you have companions, and honestly, they were interesting characters. I did like all of the companions. I thought there could have been more of them. There was only 4 in total. That might be a bit of a spoiler there, sorry about that, but there's not many. I would have liked to see more, because they were very interesting and they were very unique. They had a lot of fun interactions, so when you were in the camp, back at your base camp, just chilling out there, doing whatever, the characters would often dialogue, they would talk to each other, they would interact with each other, and there was some really interesting dialogue, just to do really fun interactions, just to sit there and listen to, you know, like campfire stories or weird anecdotes. It was just fun, and it made it kind of feel a bit more real, a bit more alive, and I like that. It was a nice touch.
Is the best treatment for snag itch, if you ask me.
I didn't ask, but I'm glad you know so much about what to do with your mother's tongue.
Oh dear, someone must have asked. And snag itch is perfectly natural, I'm sure, and nothing to be ashamed of.
Yeah, you may laugh, but you wait until you're overcome with snag itch and you're in dire need of mother's tongue.
Darling, trust me. I can handle any mother's tongue if needed.
Right. Well, I do carry it in my pack, but sure, get snag itch. See if I care.
I think there's been some confusion. Everyone is aware that mother's tongue is an herb, yes?
Of course, dearie. Marius is just too much fun to tease.
Besides, who names a plant something like that?
So they did a good job with that, and what was, even though it was a little amount, the companions were fun. What I did like as well about them was they all had their own little stories, their own little quests that you could go on and find a bit more out about them. And again, those were interesting. I liked them. I was actually invested in those quests and enjoyed going off and finding out what happened and their backstories. But one thing that did really stick out to me, and something that definitely affected my how much I enjoyed it towards the end of the game, was that I quickly realized that there was no real relationship mechanic in the game. So it didn't matter if you were the worst person in the world or the best person in the world. Your companions just stuck with you anyway. And they might have just said, oh yeah, you know, I don't agree with that. I would have done it like this. And that's it. They never left. They never abandoned you. You never lost reputation with them. They just didn't care. They just didn't care. You know, they were just like, yeah, whatever. Okay, fine. We'll still keep doing what we're doing because we said we were going to. And so I would have liked romance options. I would have liked a deeper relationship system, because like for example, in games like the old Dragon Age games, you know, or Mass Effect games, stuff like that, in RPGs like that, when I made decisions, if I was the worst person in the world, sometimes you would lose teammates through one means or another, and those decisions, I liked having that impact at the end of it. But in this game, it didn't really matter how I treated or what I did. They just stuck by me regardless, and made just a passing comment about how they weren't happy with it. But other than that, you know, it felt empty. And towards the end of the game, that diminished my interest, my connection to them towards the end of the game. It's just like, you know, whatever. Guys, we're just getting the quest done. And their abilities, they all had their own abilities as well. The companions all had their own unique ability sets. And while some of them were great and some of them worked really well, a lot of the time they felt just largely absent. It's one of these games that you definitely do a lot of the work yourself, or pretty much all of the work yourself. It was a bit like Dragon Age Veilguard. Sometimes I felt like that way as well, that it was your character just doing all of the work and your companions didn't really do much at all. I tried to do it. I built mine specifically around trying to use my companion abilities, so that works a lot better. But in Avowed, your companion's abilities don't really synchronize very well with you. And so unlike in Veilguard, at least I had them synchronizing with me to make things happen. In Avowed, I never felt like that was a thing. So that was a bit of a disappointment too. To close out this and to kind of summarize my thoughts, I want to say that, you know, if you're into action RPGs, Avowed can scratch that itch. You know, it has a good story with some great choices that seem to matter. There's multiple endings to it, so you could play it multiple times if you wanted to see it both ways. It has some great visuals and fun, if not sometimes a bit shallow combat. You know, with various styles of play to cater to your preferences. So I played a mage, but there's melee, for example, as well, and ranged, things like that. You know, the issue with the tier system and the leveling was frustrating for me at the highest difficulty, but may not be on lower difficulty. So your experience with it may vary. It may not be the same as I did. I had. But I had a good time with it. I'll be honest, I had a good time with it. It wasn't the best ARPG I've ever played, but, you know, it's not the worst either. You know, I would have liked a deeper combat. You know, more deeper combat mechanics, a better relationship system with more companions, and abilities with those companions that I could use to complement my own builds and kind of synergize with me a little bit better. That would have been great. But honestly, if you're looking for, you know, a game to kind of fill the void between the next big games that are coming out, this game could suffice and it could fill that space. It's not the worst by any means. And yeah, you know, the story alone kept me going. So I would recommend it from that perspective. And that is it. I hope this has been useful. I'm still trying to work on these reviews and these other videos I've got, so would love some positive feedback, or some feedback, in general, just so you get an idea of what you think of it. But if you like this, subscribe for more. I'm going to try to do some more of this stuff. I go live every day, and I try to publish other videos all day as well. So thank you very much. Until next time. Bye-bye.